So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our open membership event with the one, the only, the genius, Julie O'Brien from U.S. Bank. She's going to talk to us today about how behavioral design is changing product development. And you are in for a real treat. If you don't know about Julie, or if you didn't read the event information, let me help you. Julie is the key to succeeding as a PM. She marries behavioral economists' insights into human behavior drivers with design thinking's focus on empathy and innovation. Behavioral design provides the tools product people need to meaningfully impact behavior. Julie is the head of behavioral science at U.S. Bank. She bridges the worlds of academia and design. She understands the fundamental mechanics of how humans operate and uses that to solve hard problems in products that have real-world impact. Without any more talking from me, Julie, are you ready to take over the screen share?
I think so. I'm happy to be on Zoom because I spend most of my day on Teams, which is definitely not as good. But you know how habits are, once you create a new habit, it's hard to go back to the old one. So give me a second here.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, it's a button. I can tell you that much.
So yeah, I guess I should have figured this out.
It's on the bottom.
So
next
easy.
to chat.
It's the green button. Yeah, got it. Okay, cool.
Thank you, Julie. We're ready.
Great. Cool. Well, that was an amazing intro. I feel like super jazzed and energized now, ready to go. Thanks for having me and thanks for coming. I'm going to talk about behavioral design. This is something that I've spent pretty much my entire career working on, even if I didn't know that's what I was doing. And I think I've sort of hopefully gotten to the point where I can articulate a bit more clearly what this actually can do for people. So, basically, what we're trying to do here is bridge a divide. So there's tons of incredible knowledge in the academic world that has been around for years and years and years. And this world kind of is quiet and stays to itself. So there's this amazing wealth of information about human behavior that not very many people get to access. And at the same time, we've got the rest of the world, the real world, who is trying to solve all the problems that we have, which there are many of. But that part of the world does not have very good access to what the academic world knows. And this is really where behavioral design comes in. So behavioral design is one of the tools that we have for taking what the academic world knows and then bridging it and introducing it in the real world so that we can actually have more impactful and more effective solutions. And this is what I've spent my career doing. So I started out in academia. I thought it was really cool and fun and interesting, and it was. But it didn't actually give me the tools that I wanted to be able to solve real world problems. And so I went out into the tech world. I was working at O'Power, which is now part of Oracle, but was an incredible company. Then went down to Duke University and did a lot of work with many different companies with Dan Ariely, and where I got to know Kristen. And then went to Weight Watchers, where I did this in a healthcare context, and now I'm at the bank. And so I've seen lots of different variations of this. I've solved every kind of problem that you could imagine under the sun. And I've seen all different types of product teams. And really the thing that makes things happen is when we can really truly marry the academic world and what we know about behavioral science and the methods of behavioral science with product design. So if you're not already convinced, I assume you are because you're all here, but if you're not, why do we actually need this? So take a step back for a minute, think about yourself. How many apps do you have on your phone right now? If you had to guess, you probably don't have time to count, but if you had to guess, what would you say? Okay, so 150, 80, lots and lots and lots. Yeah. All right. How many of them do you use, like, regularly? Far fewer. Yeah, the numbers have gone down quite a lot. So if you take another step back and think about this in the context of our world and our society and the amount of human effort that goes into creating apps, it's pretty incredible, right? We have, I think, something like 175 billion apps that are downloaded each year. And on average, we have like 80 apps on our phones. And on average, we're using 9 of them a day. So 175 billion are created each year, and 9 of them get used on average each day. This is a huge amount of human time and energy and money that goes into building these apps, and they're not doing what we want. And the same is true of startups. I think everybody knows that most startups fail, and there's lots of reasons for that, of course, but we're spending enormous amounts of energy building solutions that we believe in and that we think are effective, and then they don't deliver the way we want them to. And so essentially, we need to evolve our methods. We need to move beyond what we've been doing in the past, tighten the wheel, do a little bit better so that we can be more efficient and have more of an impact. So one more kind of thought experiment. Imagine that you wanted to create a solution for headaches, different kind of problem than probably what you're working on. What would you do? How would you try and solve for headaches? Not as many answers. Get to the root cause, find out who has a headache, understand what triggered it, remove the head. That would also work. Yeah. Read the medical research, figure out how often it's happening, give them something else to worry about, distraction, right? So in order to solve a headache, first you'd have to really well define what problem, what type of headache. So a migraine is very different than a cluster headache. These are two different physiological experiences. But let's say we decided to solve for a migraine, you would need to go down to the core physiology that's causing that migraine. So you would say it's caused by many things, of course, but inflammation is one of them. Inflammation is that physiological thing that causes that headache. And if you identify inflammation as the thing that causes the headache, then you can go and match your solution. You can create a pill that has ibuprofen in it because ibuprofen will reduce the inflammation, which will then cure your headache. And so it's this process that we use in pharmaceuticals, same process that we use in vaccination or things like curing cancer, where we go down to the root cause at a really deep mechanistic level, and then we have a precise matching of our solution. But now imagine if you tried to solve for headaches using design thinking or a standard product design approach. What would you do? Ethnographic research. Yep. Interviews, right? You would talk to people. You would try and understand what happens in their environment that causes the headache. You would try to understand what people do already to treat their headaches. But you would never land on inflammation, right? Those methods would not tell you physiologically what's happening because your users don't know. They can't look inside of their body and say, oh, it's inflammation causing my headache. And so we should be solving for our product problems in the same way. We look at the problems that we're trying to solve, like customer acquisition, digital engagement, retention, and they seem very different because they're business problems and they happen in the real world. But every single one of these problems is caused by human behavior. So really, we need to take the same kind of mechanistic approach and precise approach if we want to impact human behavior. And so we want to use the same approach for product problems that we use for any other type of human problem. And that's where behavioral design comes in. So when I think of behavioral design and the conversations around behavioral design, I think the thing that stands out probably to everyone is that it gives you more impact. It's the tool that allows you to influence human behavior in the way that you want. But behavioral design has two other benefits that are also really important. So one is that it creates efficiency for organizations. So it allows you to move faster and get it right more often. And it allows you to scale. So if you understand the human challenge beneath the surface, that human challenge is going to show up in a lot of places. So if you solve for that core mechanism, once you know that the ibuprofen is going to cure inflammation, you have a scalable solution. It can cure headaches. It can also cure muscle soreness. It can also cure a fever potentially. Anytime that inflammation is the challenge, you have a solution. And so behavioral design gives us a lot. So I'm going to talk about the way that we use behavioral design at U.S. Bank. I'm not going to share bank examples, but I will share some real examples. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about exactly how it gives us efficiency and scale, which I think are kind of the two hidden benefits that we don't pay as much attention to. So behavioral design as we've said, is this happy marriage between behavioral science theory and product design. But behavioral design is also the integration of quantitative research methods that come out of academia. So when we think about experimentation, experimentation can be an incredible tool for us, and so can predictive surveys. And so anytime we're doing research that involves larger numbers and is trying to draw conclusions about causality or predictions, that's the type of research that comes from behavioral science and many other disciplines in academia. And it can be incredibly valuable in a product context. So the first one, behavioral science theory, this is probably what everybody is exposed to first. And there's lots of ways to learn about behavioral science theory. There's this enormous wealth of research that exists in the academic world that people have written amazing books about. And so now it's kind of part of our common conversation. I think most people understand at least some behavioral science theories. And they're kind of all over our world now. Like every tech company is using behavioral science theories somewhere in their digital experiences. So we see nudges on screens. We also see new types of information like Athleta telling me exactly where my package is, even though it has no impact on when it arrives or what I actually get, but it makes me feel like I'm getting something more valuable. And that's an application of behavioral science theory. But really, the theory is kind of meeting a need that we haven't had in the product world for a long time. So traditional approaches tell us what's above the surface. They tell us what our consumers think and feel and tell us directly. And they tell us some things about the circumstances that our customers are living in and existing in. But they can't tell us about those deeper mechanisms that are also really important. So we need to know about their biases. So where are they making shortfalls in their judgments and decision-making? We need to understand their emotions. And of course, when you're having an emotion, it influences everything in your immediate surroundings. But when you're not having an emotion, you forget that you had the emotion. And so you can't actually accurately understand how important that emotion is for influencing your behavior. And so if we want to design products that do have an impact on behavior, we have to understand how these kind of hidden elements are also driving the actions that we care about. So I'll give you an example. When I was at OPower, we started doing some work internationally. We were providing services for utility companies. And in the UK, you can change your utility company the same way you can change your cell phone provider or like your cable provider, if anybody has cable anymore. And so there's this highly competitive utility market. There's even websites that have been spun up around helping people lower their utility bills, because everybody said that the only thing they care about is price. And that kind of makes sense because the energy that you get in your home from one provider is exactly the same as the energy you get from another provider. And so the only differentiating factor, of course, would be price. That's the thing that's above the surface that we can all see. But we said, let's take a step back and try and dig a little bit deeper and see if there's something else going on. And if you do this and really think about what's involved in changing your electric provider, it's a bunch of paperwork. You have to like fill out forms, you have to get on the phone, you have to schedule somebody to come to your house and actually change the connection. And that's a lot of work. And you don't actually save that much money over the course of the year. So if you look here, 135 pounds per year versus 111 pounds per year, that's like a few dollars, which is probably not worth the time and effort and friction involved in changing your electric company. So we thought there's got to be something else that's not actually about energy or even price at all, but just about human psychology. And there's this theory in social psychology called locomotion. And the idea is that we all have different information that we use to pursue our goals. And for some people, they feel like they're pursuing their goals when they're making progress and moving quickly and just getting stuff done. And so we thought this could be related actually to this energy churn behavior. People who like to feel like they're making progress and getting stuff done, they could be the people that are more likely to go through the paperwork, do all that stuff to change their utility for $5 over a year. So we said, okay, let's find out. We did a bunch of research, which I'll describe in a little bit. And we created a new email campaign based on the idea of channeling that locomotion into a deeper relationship with the utility that they had already. So we gave them a way to get busy, do a bunch of stuff, but with their current energy company. And it had a 3.5 times impact on their churn behavior. price actually didn't impact it at all. So this was a really nice example of where the thing that people told us was that price mattered, and everybody was building solutions around price. Prices were all being driven down to compete, and then it didn't actually drive the behavior. But what really drove the behavior was this deeper psychological mechanism that's a more universal mechanism just about how we navigate life. And so by tapping into that mechanism, we were able to build a more effective solution that's also very scalable. You could take the same approach to messaging in an online portal. You could actually create a new experience in the online portal. It doesn't have to be just an email campaign. So the second thing that behavioral design gives us is quantitative research methods. Of course, there's a ton of research that is already happening in the product design process. This is really great. Obviously, I think a lot of people say, but you want us to do more? We don't have time to do more. So of course, we want to do more of the things that are worth it, that give us an ROI. And maybe you would say that not all of this is needed all the time, but we want to do research that gives us an earlier signal about what ideas are actually going to make an impact. So if you think about a traditional design thinking workshop, you are really emphasizing divergent thinking and creativity and coming up with lots of different options. And that's really important. We want to retain that. But not all options are going to be good options. So if our goal is to change behavior, we need some way of knowing which ideas are actually more likely to succeed before we go build them. And we can't just ask our users because our users can't tell us always. So we need to take their information and their feedback into account, and we need earlier signals of impact. And this is where quantitative research can be really helpful. So quantitative research could be a survey where you run a predictive model. So instead of just saying, 10% of people liked this or 10% of people thought this was motivating, we would say, we thought that locomotion was important and locomotion was correlated with churn behaviors. And it's that correlation that gives us some signal about impact. Of course, correlation is not causation. So when we can run any experiment at all, that's always better. But correlation is better than just finding out, do you feel like you are a locomotor? That doesn't really tell us that it's going to change behavior. And so when we were at OPower, we would do this kind of work a lot. So in this case, we ran a survey of people who lived in the UK, and we asked them, how often do you change your energy provider? And what's the likelihood that you're going to change your energy provider again in the next 2 months? And then we also measured a number of other things that we thought might predict that behavior. So one was locomotion. We also measured price sensitivity because that's what we had heard. And it turned out that price sensitivity was not actually correlated with the behavior we cared about, but locomotion was. So this gave us some idea that it was worth pursuing. We had higher confidence that locomotion mattered before we put any product resources towards our solution. But because we wanted to be really sure, and because we were trying to demonstrate that this was a good approach to product design, we did the full entire process. We also ran an online lab experiment. So we asked people to participate in a survey, but then in the survey, we randomized them to one of 3 different email mockups. And we just said, imagine that you got this email from your energy provider. How likely would you be to click on it? How likely would you be to then switch your utility? And we found that our email mockup that was designed around the idea of locomotion was more successful. It had a bigger impact on the outcomes that we cared about. So this gave us the information that we needed to say it's worth building an experience around this idea. This is a good idea. So the third part of behavioral design, I think, is also often overlooked. And this is the idea of systematic product design. And this is really just the process that we use and the way that we integrate behavioral science concepts and methods into the design process. I think this is also really important because what I heard a lot when I was just starting out in behavioral science outside of academia was like, this is all really interesting. I now know how to think differently, but how do I actually take that back to the process that exists in my organization and apply it? And that's a really important thing for the behavioral science community to figure out, because we want people to be able to actually work with the methods and ideas that we're giving them. So at U.S. Bank, we really think about this in terms of tightening the wheel. We're not reinventing the wheel. We're not saying do away with everything that you have ever done, but we want you to refine your process. So we still think that ideation is really important, and we think that concept testing is really important, but we do these things in a slightly different way. We also think that divergent thinking is really important, but we emphasize divergent thinking in a slightly different way. And so I'll walk through each part of the process. I'm not going to go through everything because some things are kind of pretty standard, but I'll highlight the things that are unique and really valuable about this approach. So the first part of this is defining the problem. And I assume that most of the folks on this call understand this to some level already. So I think in a lot of organizations, you hear the business objective that people have, and hopefully you have some really well-defined KPIs. And often that's all you have. So you start the design process kind of understanding in the business terms where you're headed, but that's it. And I think there's some sound if someone wants to mute themselves. So the thing that we really want to do with behavioral design, though, is make that even stronger by emphasizing that key behavior and all of the key behaviors in the process that are important. So we have our key behavior, which might be the ultimate thing that we want people to do, but there's a lot of other behaviors that will get us to that key behavior. So when we start with a solid understanding of all of the in real life human behaviors that matter, we can actually prioritize. And sometimes it turns out that the thing we thought that mattered a whole lot is not actually the thing that matters as much. And of course, if you do have data that you can bring to this process, that's even better. It's great if you can apply analytics and say, you know, these ones, and these ones cause the biggest drop off, and these ones people are able to just kind of go on. But a lot of the time, the behaviors that matter are outside of your direct control. So if you think about a financial decision, if someone is married, your user might be the person who is going through your digital experience, but they have to have a conversation with their spouse, and that happens outside of your digital experience. And so there's many behaviors that we want to understand so we can come up with the right solution. So then we go into some version of behavior mapping. And of course, there's a lot of different types of behavior maps that you can use. But the thing that's important is that your behavior map is identifying the psychological mechanisms that are getting in the way. And when I talked earlier about the iceberg metaphor, there's a lot of things on the surface that are important that we want to pay attention to. And we want to document all of those things here. But what's even more important is the stuff beneath the surface. So even if you're not a trained behavioral scientist or a psychologist, you can still come up with some hypotheses. You can say, what is it about their general emotion or their general personality or their general way of existing in the world or their social context that can help me recontextualize this behavior in a different way? And when we look deeper and identify those barriers, we're better able to understand where there's likely to be a problem. So when we come up with something and there's a barrier that we have experienced ourselves, even, we will know that that's a really hard barrier to overcome. So we want to know everything there is to know about the problem. And a lot of the time in an ideal world, this also involves research. I used to work with teams and they would say, I feel really uncomfortable picking a barrier because how do I know it's right? And you don't, but that's part of science, is you have to, use systematic logic, rely on what has been done in the past, and then formulate a good, strong hypothesis. But when you can do research at this stage, this is a great point to run a predictive survey. You could say we have 3 barriers that we identified, and we think that they all really matter, but we don't know which one matters the most. And that's where you could run a survey where you measure those 3 barriers and you see which one has the strongest correlation with the behavior that you want to change. But here is probably the most important part of this entire process. So when we talked about the headache example in ibuprofen, the thing that makes a drug effective is if it actually solves that physiological problem that's manifesting in some symptom. And it's that precise matching that is required for drugs to be on the market. But it's the same thing that we need when we're solving for human behavior. So when we do behavior mapping and we're identifying barriers, we are then being really precise about the solution that we think can reduce that barrier. And that precise matching is what gives us something that we think we can actually win with. And that also gives us something more systematic for future research to be able to validate. So if you put a concept in front of a user, every concept is going to have different words, a different feel to it, a different appearance, a different layout, a different scenario that you're asking somebody to walk through. And so you get feedback from your user, but you don't know what that feedback is actually about. When you start that process with a behavior, a barrier, and a solution, and they all line up and they match, now you can interpret that user feedback in a much more nuanced way. You know exactly what you're looking for, and you know exactly why and how it should work. And so what we do at the bank to really reinforce this and make it translatable to design is we create a solution blueprint. And I think this is one of the really important pieces of the process that really creates that connection between the conceptual space of behavioral science theory and the practical space of you have to deliver a product. We want to be able to translate between that conceptual space and say, okay, we said that we're trying to reduce psychological distance. That sounds great, but what does it actually look like on a screen that a user is going to interact with? And so here we want to articulate upfront the strategy that we're using, the behavior that it's supposed to influence, and then the way that it works. This also is what brings intentionality to the design process. If you understand exactly how your solution is supposed to work, you know what to look for when you get into your user testing and when you launch your product in the wild. And so you can create almost like a formula or a recipe, and you can say, my solution has to have component A, B, and C, and that is what's going to make it work in the intended way. So an example, let's say that you have to have a customer complete a very long and boring but necessary process. This happens a lot in financial circumstances and many other healthcare circumstances. Paying your taxes is kind of similar. So you want people to actually go through this long process. You've already removed all the friction that you possibly can. Maybe you've added other incentives and nudges, but you want something more. Let's say that you have this hypothesis that a more human interaction is going to motivate people through the process. So your solution blueprint might be a more human interaction is going to influence the behavior of completing this boring task because the experience is going to feel more meaningful and create a sense of commitment. That all makes sense, but how do you know when you look at a design that it does these things? This is where the translation becomes really tricky. You want to go into ideation and create a wireframe or a customer journey and know that it's actually creating that human interaction. And so what you can do is you can define upfront what has to be present in the experience if it's going to create that interaction that you want. So for example, you might say, this design should have a we state. So we're in this together. Let me help you. We'll do it together. There's got to be some form of reciprocity maybe. So I'm doing this for you, and in return, you're going to get something back. That's kind of part of our social contract. And when you have that version of reciprocity, it makes people feel like they're in a social interaction. And of course, you want to have a conversational tone because you want it to feel like you're talking to a human. So this is now something that you can use when you go into ideation. It's also something that you can take into your design review and say, I don't want any random feedback. I want feedback on whether my design has a we state, has reciprocity, and has a conversational tone. So it also gives you a way of helping your peers in your organization give you really helpful feedback that isn't going to derail you and send you down a tangent that maybe is not helpful. You can then take your solution blueprint and build out your entire product roadmap from here. So I'm not going to talk about concept testing and deployment. These are kind of like standard things. But what is important is that you can take everything you generate from your solution blueprint and build your entire roadmap from there. So in this case, let's say you want to reduce psychological distance. So many of the behaviors that we care about, whether it's doing something healthy today so that you can be healthy in the future, or saving money today so that you have more money in the future, these are all challenges of psychological distance. Today is concrete, and so I pay attention to the things that feel good right now. The future is abstract and it's uncertain, and so I might not care as much about benefits in the future if something that feels really good today is actually, going to be more motivating to me. And so a lot of the time we want to reduce the distance between the future and today so that people do the healthy behavior that's good for them in the future, but maybe not as appealing right now. And there's a lot of ways that we can reduce psychological distance. We can make the future feel more concrete. That's going to make it feel kind of more like the present. We can create rules of thumbs that are then easy to apply. We can create new rewards for behaviors today that make the unhealthy behavior feel a little bit better. Or you could help somebody think about their future life so that it becomes more of a person that you want to connect to. These are all really different conceptual approaches, but the solution blueprint allows you to build out tangible product experiences from these conceptual ideas. So you can go into ideation and say, how might we design an email campaign that creates this tangible representation of a future outcome? And you might have 4 different emails that all do this in a different way, but they all ladder up to that same conceptual solution strategy. You want probably an end-to-end experience. You want it to feel cohesive across different interactions. So this also allows you to sketch out, what is that end-to-end experience going to look like? If I want to create a future representation that feels really tangible, if I do it one time, that's great. But if I do it multiple times through multiple interactions, that's even better. And so this allows you to plan all of that out. And so the idea here is that we spend more time in the problem space so that we can speed up when we're actually executing and ideating and testing and deploying. And so that we can ensure that whatever we build has a purpose and it's a precise solution to match the problems that we're trying to solve. So I'm going to talk a high level what this looks like when you put this all together. And this is another example from O-Power where, in a way, this is kind of not exactly how things happened because we were actually figuring out this process as we went. But I think because of the circumstances of the company, we had the freedom and flexibility to do things in a new way, in a different way, which allowed us to start to develop some of these methods. So O-Power was a behavioral energy efficiency company. It was started by 2 guys who wanted to have a positive impact on the environment. They wanted to reduce carbon. And they looked around at all the different ways that they could do that. And they decided that the best way was to help people use less energy at home. This is not a new goal. Lots of companies have tried to do this in the past. Every utility in America, at least, is actually regulated to help people use less energy in their homes. But it has not actually created a lot of progress on this massive, large-scale problem that we have. So they said, okay, these are the behaviors that we want to influence. And then they went into the academic literature. And they found a study that was run by Cialdini showing that even though the objective and rational reason for saving energy at home is to save money, do something good for the environment, or be a good citizen, those messages did not actually motivate behavior change. And that makes sense. We already talked about money. You don't really save that much money, so it's not super motivating. People do care about the planet, of course, but the impact to the planet in the future is not very strongly connected to like turning your lights off one time in your living room. And of course, being a good citizen is like really hard to imagine what that even means. But finding out that you're doing something that is different from your neighbors, that's really powerful. And so they created the Home Energy Report, which many of you might actually get still, that leveraged this social norms comparison. And essentially, this gave them a solution blueprint. So their key behavior was to reduce all of these household energy behaviors, like turning your lights off, even installing energy efficient appliances, and turning your thermostat down. And they knew that the best way to do that was to give people social norms feedback that would recontextualize their behaviors in a new way. But as the company was growing, we started to expand internationally, and we had to figure out if the same solution would work in very different contexts. So a social norms comparison is using social norms, and we know that social norms are dependent on the social environment. And so we would go into other countries like the UAE, and people would say, your social norms are not going to work here because we have a very different culture, very different social context. And we wanted to understand, is our solution blueprint of using social information, is that actually going to work somewhere else? And so we ran a survey, And we wanted to understand, do we see the same mechanisms at play in other places? So in the US, it's really impossible to know if you're a good energy user or a bad energy user, because when you get your electric bill, they tell you the price and the kilowatt hours, and that's it. So who knows if $100 a month is good or bad? It's really hard to know. And so it's easy to distort that information and make yourself feel like you're doing really well. And it's that distortion that actually is part of why a social norms intervention is effective. So if I think that I'm doing really well and then I find out that I'm not, that's motivating. And so we measured this same basic principle, the better than average effect, and we ran a survey of 10 different countries around the world. And we found out that humans are humans are humans. It does not matter where you go. Everybody wants to think that they're doing better than everybody else. And because we had that information, we could confidently go into these other countries with the same solution blueprint and feel really confident that it was going to work. And if you think about this from the perspective of a startup where the stakes are really high, this was a way to reduce risk. We did this survey, and of course, we did a lot of other localization research, but tapping into that mechanism to make sure that our secret sauce was going to work gave us confidence to go into these sales situations and confidently say that, yes, this is actually an effective solution, even in a very different social context. So later, we had to kind of refresh our home energy report. There was sort of like more pressure to make it look more modern. And we had another similar challenge in front of us. How do we take what works really, really well, change the look and feel, but make sure that it's still going to work just as well as it did before? And one thing that's an important nuance here is that O'Power actually ran the largest and longest randomized control trials that I think have been known to man, or at least, several years ago they were. And so they had a huge, they placed a huge value on experimental data. So that was great. But the thing is that it actually took about 9 months to see an impact from a home energy report. So you would get the report the first time, and then you'd kind of try some new behaviors in your home, but then it would go away. Then you'd get another report a month later, try a few more behaviors. And it took about 9 months for a new habit to form. And so we didn't have 9 months to put a new report into the market and then find out that it didn't work. We had to know from day one that it was going to work. And so it raised the question, what is the thing that has to be there no matter what it looks like, that's still going to make it work? And my team had done some research on this, and we were starting to learn that part of what made the home energy report effective was that it actually made you feel kind of bad. So we all like to think of ourselves as these like really good people, like we're kind of, the image of all of our values, doing well all the time. But of course, in reality, we're not actually as good as we would like to be all the time. And so if you're made aware of the difference between who you are right now and who you want to be, it creates a self-discrepancy, and that does not feel good. And it turns out that the O'Power Home Energy Report was kind of highlighting a self-discrepancy. So we knew that everybody thought that they were a better than average energy user. And then they would get this report that would say, you are not a better than average energy user. In fact, you're an energy hog. It would create this self-discrepancy that did not feel very good. And there's two different things that can happen when you don't feel good. So one is the ostrich effect, right? You are faced with something unpleasant and you don't want to deal with it. And so the easiest thing to do is ignore it and walk away. In the context of O'Power, that would have been really bad. That would have meant that we would send out these reports, it would make people feel bad, and they would just ignore it and walk away. What can also happen, though, is that you're faced with the bad news, the self-discrepancy, and then you see that the easiest thing to do is to take an action that closes that distance. And through our research, we learned that it was that self-discrepancy shrinking that happens through taking an action that actually made people stay focused on the report. It made their bad feelings go away, and it made them actually take the action to make progress towards their ideal self. And so this became a really important point for us as we redesigned our home energy reports. We knew that the normative comparison alone was not the entire secret sauce or solution blueprint. There was more to it. You had to have the normative comparison paired with tips, just really simple things that you can do right now, so that people didn't stay in that negative emotional state and instead they took an action. And so because we had figured out that that was part of the mechanism, this giving people an action right away when they have that emotional experience. We redesigned the home energy report with the tips on the front, so we were able to retain the impact that we were having. So I think so far, I've basically illustrated how behavioral design gives us impact, right? If we understand the human behaviors that we're trying to solve, and we understand the human mechanism responsible for the behavior, and we precisely match our solutions to that mechanism, we get impact. But I started by saying that you also get efficiency and scale. And I think this is also really important if you're trying to build out a behavioral science team within an organization. Because a lot of people say, you want me to do more things in my process? How are we ever going to do that? That takes too much time. It's going to slow us down. And in some ways, like when you try to do something new, it does slow you down. It's hard to do new things until, of course, you build a habit. But because of the way that behavioral design brings more certainty to the process up front, and because it gives you a focus on the core human behavior rather than the surface level details, you also get scale. So when you bring behavioral science into an organization, you get impact, which of course is your immediate goal, but you also get efficiency and scale. So we typically think about this as a comparison to a traditional product design approach where we have a very high tolerance for failure. We talked at the beginning about the number of apps that are developed each year, 175 billion, that basically nobody uses and they don't do the things that we want. Probably many of the people here have also had a similar experience. So a lot of the time in organizations, we say, we're going to launch something. We just want to get it out. It's going to be an MVP and we'll come back and we'll fix it later. And then we never come back and fix it later. And now we have something in the world that doesn't really do very much for us and people don't really interact with. The other thing that happens is when we go into an approach like design thinking, we are basically emphasizing creativity over impact. And creativity is very important, and I don't want to say that it's not, but impact is also important. And so often what happens if all we want to emphasize is creativity, then decision-making is subjective. You can create an experience, go into a design review, and a senior leader says, I don't like it, or why didn't you do it this way, or why didn't you do it that way? And you don't have much to say, and so you pivot and you change direction. Or you go in front of a user and your user says, I don't know, I don't understand, I'm not sure how I would do this. And you kind of have to go back to the beginning. So there's a lot of starting and stopping, and iteration, of course, is good. We want to be able to pivot as soon as we need to, but we want to pivot for the right reasons because we're learning really important things along the way. So in a traditional approach, we have a lot of starting and stopping. And so in the end, we actually end up spending a lot of time on things that don't really give us much value. And we end up launching a lot of experiences that are not hitting the mark. So behavioral design is essentially design on steroids. So, we take that creativity, we take that divergent thinking, and we focus it. So we create rubrics and we create structure to the process so that we get more precision. We know why something is supposed to work and how it's supposed to work. So we know how to evaluate it. And if that mechanism is wrong, that's a useful pivot. We should pivot when we find out that we actually didn't understand the problem the right way. But then that should inform all of the next problems that we're trying to solve. So that can be incredibly useful to us. It means we spend less time having debates over opinions. You can go into a design review and you can say, here's the data, here's the evidence, here's the academic literature, and here's how it's supposed to work. Give me feedback on how it's supposed to work. And it means that in the end, you get things that actually work. And so, of course, impact is what we care about, but things that are more impactful over time also mean you're more efficient. So we end up spending our time more wisely and we get a bigger bang for our buck. And we get scale across our experiences. So I already talked through this a little bit, but understanding conceptually in the conceptual space, in the human behavior space, understanding what you need to solve for and how, it gives you like months and months and months of roadmap. So you can do that upfront work and really understand what direction you need to take. And then you can build out many, many quarters of experiences that you're just executing from. And so that also creates efficiency because you're doing that work once, and then you can just push go and deploy. And it means that when you do run experiments, which hopefully everybody is doing, these experiments are more useful to you. So in a lot of product organizations, there's a huge emphasis, especially in recent years, on A/B testing. And A/B testing is incredibly important. That's how we learn whether we actually had an impact the way we wanted to or not. It's also how we learn to iterate and optimize along the way. But organizations run hundreds and hundreds of experiments, and they're not very good at aggregating across those experiments to see the bigger picture and figure out what the meaning is. And so if you start with a solution blueprint, so if you say, our goal is to reduce psychological distance, or our goal is to create a human interaction, or even our goal is to reduce friction, you can start to cluster your experiments around those goals. So you can say, I have 5 experiments that are all about creating a human interaction, and I have 5 other ones that are all about reducing psychological distance. And because any experiment is subject to error, sometimes it's going to be a positive outcome, even if it's not a real outcome. You actually learn much more over time. So you can say, I had 5 experiments that all showed me that reducing psychological distance created an impact to the behavior. That's incredibly valuable. Now you can go take psychological distance to any problem that looks like the one you started out with. So you learn faster as an organization, you get more out of the A/B tests that you're doing already, and you solve the next problem while you're solving that first problem. And so ultimately, if we're solving for the human behavior challenge that's beneath the surface, that's creating all of these business problems that we actually care about, you get scale, you get efficiency, and you get impact. So that's it. This is my team. I just wanted to give them a shout out because they're incredible and really helped out a lot in refining our process, our approach. And this is the work that we're doing at U.S. Bank. And I would love to hear thoughts, comments, questions, anything that's on your mind.
Thank you so much, Julie. I've been pooling questions in the background. The first one, I don't think this person is here. They posted this in the chat, and I think you covered it in the middle of your presentation, but maybe if you could encapsulate it. It's a simple question. It's from Etika Shashank. And the question is, how does behavioral design differ from design thinking? Again, you talked about it, but if you had to put it in a little package, you would say.
So I think that behavioral design adds precision to design thinking. So we want to retain divergent, convergent thinking. We want to retain empathy for our users, but we want a better sense of what's going to impact behavior earlier in the process. So when we have precision and we have that matching, that is helping us get better certainty earlier in the process that we're designing something that will make an impact.
Awesome. That is a quotable, precision to design thinking. It's like a t-shirt. Love it. Love it. Multiple people were asking you to talk about, motivation and the locomotion mechanism and such. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there's a whole body of literature psychology on what's called self-regulation or kind of non-conscious motivation. And, your brain evolved for efficiency. We have to make really quick judgments in order to navigate the complex world that we live in. And one of the ways that we evolved to do that was through this system of self-regulation. And there's many rules that guide this system, and they're all happening in the background. And so locomotion is one of those rules. I think people have probably heard about like loss aversion, where we're more sensitive to losses than to gains, but that's also related to our system of self-regulation, where we're kind of always on the lookout for avoiding things that could be bad for us. And we don't necessarily realize that it's happening. It's happening in the background. It's our way of navigating a complex world efficiently and making good enough decisions most of the time.
Awesome. Claire, are you in the mix? Would you like to, you had a question about measuring success. Would you like to come on mic?
Hi,
Hey, Claire, how are you? Where are you?
Singapore.
Singapore. Awesome. Great to have you here. So yeah, go ahead and ask your question.
I was just wondering how does Julie measure success using that method? And yeah, also echoing the rest. I think she just explained about the mechanisms part. Yeah,
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Claire.
thank you.
Yeah, so was that question about measuring success? I don't think I heard all of it.
Yeah. How do you measure success through this method? I mean, what do you determine as metrics?
So I think every organization should be measuring success based on impact to outcomes. I think often we come up with sort of like coarse grain measurements for success. We talk about, baseline this year versus last year. All of those are fine, but not great. I think to be really good at measuring success, we should be running experiments and understanding, are we incrementally getting better over time? And then we should measure our process just like any other thing that we're doing. So every process should be incrementally improving our outcomes over time. And we should just make sure that we're using good data to draw conclusions. So the more experiments, the better. But of course, higher quality experiments will lead to more impact and more efficiency.
That's great. Awesome. Thank you. Hannah, where are you? Would you like to ask your question?
Hey, yeah, I will try. So I'm wondering how you might apply this, like the solution blueprint framework within the behavioral design process to issues related to human services, specifically like education sector, when you are both looking at kind of like the need that you need to meet, but also kind of constrained by what is possible in the evidence base for interventions.
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
So that's a really good question. And I think that challenge shows up in lots of places, not just education, but when I was at OPower, we would talk about the intersection between what the clinical trial world showed and what was acceptable in a consumer context. And there's lots of things that will help somebody lose weight that nobody will ever buy. And so those things are not options. And so I think, when you're going through that process, our goal is to identify things that can make an impact earlier. And that's just an additional lens that you bring to that process. You say, we know that these things are just not possible. We don't even consider it. It might be helpful for understanding the problem. So it might be a useful input when you're like kind of starting off, but it's just another evaluation criteria that you add to say, like, what can we actually move forward with?
Thank you.
Awesome. Michelle Handy, would you like to ask your question? And you may be the final question of the day.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Julie. Good to
Is
see
this
you
a rare
again.
question?
You.
Yeah, Julie was my manager, previous manager. So thank you for inspiring me to get into the field of behavioral science. I'm here because of Julie. So I just started a new position in an organization that kind of has like an old school way of running things. So where do you think behavioral science can be most impactful if product is not taking a human-centered approach and is just committed to meeting deadlines and delivery dates?
Yeah, that is a really, really hard problem and a common challenge that a lot of people have. I think one is find your advocates. There's always people in every organization who kind of think this way. And maybe they don't have all of the background and all of the skills, but they kind of, there's something that's like, oh yeah, there's something missing and they know it. Find those people and collaborate with them. And then tell stories. I mean, I think like the most important thing is to find a project where, regardless of what happens, you can tell a good story. So obviously you want good work and you want good inputs, but you also want a case study at the end of it that you can put on a slide and inspire people. And so you have to be kind of strategic to say, we're going to do the work, but now the work is also the way that we influence people. And so there's this extra layer that you have to bring to kind of make sure it does both of those things for you.
Thank you.
That's awesome. Kristen, are you there? Because I wanted to pose a question, a Kristen Julie question.
I'm here. I'm here.
Yeah, that wasn't an existential question. I mean, you're physically there. So we did get a couple questions in the chat about, how do I learn more about solution blueprinting and how is this similar to behavioral diagnoses that we're learning in the course? Can you lead off, Kristen, and then hand the baton to Julie?
Yeah, I love the concept of solution blueprinting. The core, Julie and I basically grew up with the same theory. We are students of Dan Ariely. And the lab back in the day, probably over 10 years ago now, really thought deeply about the behavioral diagnosis and mapping process and how we identify psychologies. And so Julie figured it out at OPower, came to the lab. There was a lot of mind melding, and this is kind of some of the core process with different names and analogies. And Julie uses some really fun ones. So at the heart of it, it's the same, and we call things slightly different things, but generally it's the same process. Would you agree, Julie, or am I
Yeah, totally. I was gonna say I learned from you, but yeah, I think that I've hugely benefited from working together and thinking more about these methods. And yeah, I think it's absolutely the same approach.
Oh, that's spectacular. So to wrap up, first and foremost, thank you to Julie. Thank you for Kristen for hanging out with us today and giving us those party tips. For those of you that came early, gotta be there early if you want the bonus tips. Can we all give Julie a virtual or real round of applause? Drop some Zoom emojis. Share the love. We appreciate you visiting us so much. I did get a note from someone who will remain unnamed. They're like, this woman's a machine. This is awesome. When can I get the recording? To
Oh.
that question, I have an answer.